I have always been drawn to places I shouldn't go, especially when I was younger. The moment something felt out of reach, my curiosity would demand to know more. I moved to the Pacific Northwest when I was about 12 years old, and that errant desire only grew stronger. The thick woods stretched on endlessly in every direction, and it didn't take me long to figure out that they harbored their own secrets. If you spend enough time out there, you are bound to find one of them. Concrete boxes swallowed by moss, or fences that guarded nothing at all. Most of these were unmarked and forgotten. To the locals, they were simply a fact of life. But not to me. Kids love to theorize about the purposes of these places. In doing so, they would invariably concoct some creepy, paranormal experience to go along with it. And of course, all of these stories are too vague to trace or fact-check, and none of them ever happened to who was actually telling the story. Regardless, one theory always stuck out to me. Abandoned military sites. This wasn't some far-off theory either. The region is no stranger to the various Cold War-era machinations of the US government. I actually lived on one of the still-in-use military bases. This granted me some insight into what these places used to be. Usually, the theories were correct. Most were created shortly before, during, or after World War II. As the war machine rapidly shifted focus in the early days of the Cold War, the less important sites were simply left to rot. The more expensive structures, the coastal batteries, bunkers, and missile complexes were sold off to the highest bidder. Then I discovered the Nike program. Project Nike was a US military program that rose out of the ashes of World War II. Trepidations about another war, one far more destructive than the last, led to the US government lining the pockets of defense contractors seeking new and innovative weapons of warfare. High-altitude bombers and long-range nuclear-capable missiles necessitated the invention of anti-aircraft weaponry capable of countering them. The more I read about them, the more obsessed I became. By 1958, the Nike Hercules missile was developed by Bell Laboratories, designed to destroy entire Soviet bomber formations with a tactical nuclear explosion. 265 Nike sites were created all across the United States, mainly to defend large population centers and military installations. There were 18 in my state. 5 were within driving distance of me. I became particularly enthralled by these. I was always crazy about history, but my unquenchable youthful curiosity was kindled by these places that were tantalizingly close, yet mysterious and bygone. But most of them were privately owned or flooded, too dangerous to explore. I spent hours scouring online, learning everything I could about each and every one, but I never got to go to one. By the time I got to high school, I had kind of forgotten about the whole thing. Just like everyone else, I was more concerned with sports, girls, and trying to be liked than I was with obscure Cold War public history. In the fall of my sophomore year, I joined the cross-country team. For practice one day, we were sent on this long run up and around the lake on the far side of town. If you followed the trail, you'd end up back on the main road that led to the school in about 5 or 6 miles. It was supposed to take about an hour or so, but we were also a bunch of bored teenage boys, so naturally, we got sidetracked. As the older and more serious runners left us behind, we had already decided we weren't running that far today. Instead, a small group of us slowed to a walk. With the lake to our right and a steep, overgrown bluff to our left, my friend turned and stopped us. "Hey, you guys want to see something cool?" There was a tone in his voice, like he had been waiting this whole time to say that. I was in. The others followed. We scrambled up a steep dirt path that departed into the bushes off to the side of the main trail. We quickly gained altitude, but it seemed like the trail just kept going up. Laughing and joking, we occasionally lost our footing and slid back a few feet before continuing up the slope with more care. During this ascent, I came to an abrupt realization. Despite living here for a few years, I had never explored much of the town before. Unlike most of my friends, I had no idea where anything actually was. My childish sense of direction rested solely on the main roads that the bus took me every day. I was trying to think of what we could be going to see, and my mind wandered further than my body. A thought crossed my mind, one I hadn't had in years. The abandoned military posts. The Nike sites. There were a handful nearby, right? It lingered. Could I actually get to see one of these? Before I could finish that thought, we crested the top of the hill and entered a rocky, uneven clearing. About 50 or so feet in either direction, the place was covered in dead grass and pine needles, and the misty October air felt colder than it had down by the lake. Despite its overgrown surroundings, the glade was devoid of any taller vegetation, save for a large rock that rested on top of a short cliff face. I guess not. I resigned that thought as quickly as it entered my head. We clambered up onto the rocks and grabbed our seats. The soft, ethereal atmosphere of the cool afternoon elevated the already beautiful overlook. The peak of the hill granted you sight over the treetops, the lake, and the little town on the other side. It was breathtaking. The lack of tree cover allowed the wind to tear into us. I turned my head into my shoulder to duck out of the icy breeze, but something caught my eye when I did. Concrete. I jumped down off the rock and walked over to the faded slab, an elongated rectangle of old cement. On one side, leading down into a lower section of the clearing, were about 8 or 9 cracked concrete stairs. On one of them were a few weathered white footprints. It was the foundation of an old building. Besides a rusted metal pole sticking out of the rock near the structure, there was nothing else man-made that I could see. No wood, nails, or sheet metal. Why was there an old foundation all the way up here? Where did the rest of the building go? After looking around for a moment, all I found were a couple of old beer cans and glass bottles. Before I could continue any further, my friends seemed to have decided it was time to hit back. One of them called me over. We should probably get going before Coach realizes we aren't back. Yeah, I replied as I jogged over. Hey, do you know what that old building is from? Not really, he surmised. It's been there as long as I can remember. Maybe it was a lookout tower or something. I don't know. He trailed off before walking ahead of me to fit down the narrow trail. I stopped for a second and looked back at the clearing, taking a mental picture of everything. Lookout tower. Suddenly, my attention was caught again. Just beyond the clearing, obscured in the trees, was something yellow. A small metal sign with big black box writing. It took me a second to recognize what it was, but it looked like one of those old caution signs. I was locked, fixated on that speck of color in the sea of green and brown. My skin tingled with static. Every hair on my arms stood on end. Hey Preston, let's go! The yell from down the slope snapped me out of my trance. I jogged down after my friends. I never went back. In fact, I'd barely given that place any thought since that cold afternoon. But this past spring, it all came rushing back. I'm now a history student at a local university. My public history class focused on all things abandoned. Old roads, faded signs, derelict buildings, and concrete ruins. By the end of the semester, we were tasked with discovering the story behind a local, historical site. As soon as the assignment was announced, something shifted in me. The Nike sites. Now I had a reason to go back to them. A reason that mattered. I didn't want to just read about history anymore. I wanted to stand in it. And this time, I had the tools and the knowledge to dig deeper. Maps, archives, declassified reports, and site coordinates. All of it. It wasn't just for a grade. This was the kind of thing I imagined myself doing when I daydreamed about being a real historian, researching something nobody else cared about, uncovering it and bringing it back into the light. So, I made up my mind. I was going to find one and tell its story. God, I wish I hadn't. I wasn't stupid. I knew the risks that something like this involved. Most, if not all of these sites are now privately owned and restricted to outsiders. That's not even considering the fact that they were built in the 50s. They were falling apart, lined with asbestos, chipping lead paint, and God knows what else. So I prepared myself. I spent hours scouring urban exploring guides and figured out exactly what I needed to protect myself, and then some. I bought a respirator, the kind they use for painting, work gloves, a headlamp, some glow sticks, a pair of bolt cutters, and a backup flashlight. I scavenged a hat, some thick work pants, a waterproof soft-shell jacket, and some boots from my dad's old military gear. I also packed a first aid kit and a few other essentials. It's a bit overkill, I know, but I'm not exactly a seasoned explorer, and considering I was doing this alone, I wanted to be prepared for anything. I also couldn't just throw this on and go to the first place I could find. I figured that not all of them would be accessible, and I definitely didn't want to deal with the cops or some disgruntled landowner with a rifle. In the following weeks, I discovered that a few of these places were actually on Google Maps, but as you can imagine, those were not the most ideal for what I had in mind. No, I needed something off the beaten path, something that wasn't public knowledge. The forums and documents I found all came up with the same results: privately owned, flooded, buried, and forgotten. If I still couldn't step foot inside one, what was even the point? The end of the semester was growing closer and closer, and I was still empty-handed. That's when it came back to me. The day on the hill by the lake, the strange foundation, the staircase to nowhere, and the yellow sign hidden in the trees. That could be it. Even at the time, I thought there was more up there, but I hadn't been there in years. I didn't even remember exactly where it was. Still, it was my best option if I wanted to find something truly unique. I had made up my mind. It wasn't until Friday that I found time to make it out to the lake. I parked my car near the boat launch, grabbed my bag, and started down the trail. I moved slowly, carefully scanning the edge for any sign of narrow trails that led up into the woods. I walked all the way to the far end, maybe a mile and a half, and doubled back. About halfway back, I finally saw something. About 30 yards up the hill, nestled between two tall pine trees, were a few red beer cans. Behind the litter was a jagged rock face, half hidden behind a curtain of tree branches. After a few minutes of clambering up a steel game trail, I reached a flatter part of the terrain and paused to catch my breath. I looked around, taken aback. This was it. It wasn't exactly as I remembered. My young imagination had inflated everything. The cliff wasn't nearly as tall. The clearing wasn't as big, but the important details were still there. One landmark in particular had overtaken my memory of the place, and staring at it again in person felt dreamlike. For some reason, those stairs had stood out in my mind more than the view or the people ever had. I can't even remember exactly who was with me when I first saw them, but for some reason, I always remembered the stairs. I walked over and stood at the top. 9 steps, faded white footprints, leading to nowhere. I hadn't felt anything off-putting until then. It was kind of fun being on a quest to rediscover something I had built up in my memory for so long. But that feeling was gone in an instant. The moment I stood at the top and looked down at the grass below, I was overcome with the most profound sense of dread I had ever experienced. My heart caught in my throat. I staggered back off the concrete and frantically looked around. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. The serene nature around me seemingly dropped its facade. It felt like the trees were shrouding something, and the world itself was pressing in on me. But as quickly as I looked around, the fleeting panic faded. My paranoia refused to settle, but when I realized there truly was nothing there, I relaxed a little. Just your imagination, getting worked up over nothing. I avoided the steps entirely after that. Even looking at them made my stomach turn. I followed a small dirt path away from the large rock, the same way I remembered approaching as a kid. The forest was much less dense up here, and it felt completely different from the thick greenery toward the base. The ground was almost entirely covered in dried pine needles and rocky outcroppings. It didn't just look different up here, it felt different. The energy in the air felt slightly charged, like the build-up before a lightning storm, but the sky remained soft and blue. The air felt alive, aware. I was lost in a trance for a moment, staring off into the trees. Finally, I snapped out of it. I didn't come up here to reminisce in the woods. I came here to find that sign. I spun around and saw that faded yellow peering out from behind a branch about 100 feet away. Exactly like I had remembered it, like it had been waiting. I made my way over to the shoddy marker and knelt down in front of it. The paint flaked and chipped, but the words were still clear. Caution, this area is patrolled by sentry dogs. Was it attached to a tree? No, there was no bark. A slender wooden post reached up into the sky a few feet over my head before a sharp crack indicated its fate. I glanced behind it, but saw nothing. A telephone pole? Where's the top? I leaned back and looked around. Behind me, there were no signs of any other poles, fences, or anything for that matter. The other way proved more promising. Maybe 150 feet away, I saw exactly what I was looking for. Another stripped lock stood out amongst the pines, so I followed them. Some of the poles were snapped in half or rotting, others still held their tops, just enough to confirm what they once were. The wires that remained sagged down onto the forest floor, sprawling across the underbrush like creeping vines. I remember being surprised that they hadn't caused a fire, but I surmised that no power had flowed through them in decades anyway. I'm not exactly sure how long I had followed them for. The forest grew thicker, and the poles were harder to spot each time. Eventually, I reached a wall of thick pine trees that stretched all the way to the ground. I glanced up at the pole next to me and saw that its wires extended into the trees and disappeared. I laid down and squeezed my way through the branches. I turned my face to protect my eyes from the brittle needles and reached forward, feeling my way through. At some point, I reached out to try to grab onto a branch. That's when I felt it. Cold, hard, tarmac. I heaved my body forward and sat up on my knees. Directly on the other side of the branches were a slab of pavement that ran perpendicular to the ground. Its abrupt edge was raised about a foot off the forest floor. I slid forward onto it and crawled out from under the tree. In front of me was an overgrown asphalt road about 10 feet wide. It continued straight for a few hundred feet, the wooden poles on the left side paralleling it through the trees. Then I saw something. Exactly what I had been looking for. A decrepit chain-link gate in a pale white shack, half sunken into the ground. I scrambled to my feet and looked down at the asphalt. The road just abruptly began on the other side of the thicket. The earth I had just crawled along seemed to almost avoid touching it. The edges of the blacktop too sharp, the colors of the undergrowth distinctly different from the grass that grew on top of the tarmac. It looked imposed, like it had been dragged from someplace else and dropped here in the middle of nowhere. It didn't belong. I started down the road. As I approached the gate, bewilderment gave way to excitement. I had found something. I stepped cautiously into what looked like an old checkpoint. To one side of the rusted gate, a guard shack leaned crookedly, its windows cracked and choked with dust. The sun-bleached wood was splintered, and peeling paint clung to the weathered frame. The sunken booth was small, just enough room for one person to stand inside. 3 windows faced outward, and its rotted door hung open toward the road. I peeked inside. Empty. Just dirt and splintered floorboards. I moved on. The gate itself was rusted and falling apart, but the chain link held on enough to prevent entry. The corroded barbed wire on top persuaded me against climbing it. On the fence, a bleached sign with bright red writing stood sentry. U.S. Army Restricted Area Warning. I stared at it for a second. Long after it served its purpose, it still felt like a threat. I walked along the perimeter, past the guard shack, and into the trees off the side of the road. I followed it for a while, the other side mostly obscured by high bushes and overgrown foliage, before I came across exactly what I had been searching for. My way in. In front of me, a section of the chain link had detached itself partially from its post. I bent down, grabbed a hold of it, and wrenched it backwards. The metal struggled briefly, then tore away like old fabric. I rolled the fence back enough so that I could crawl through. I sent my back first and followed after it. I'm not sure what I expected on the other side, but all I met with were more trees. These were spaced out more than the ones near the road, and as I walked through them, My eye caught sight of a large, light blue structure. It was a 2-story rectangular building about 50 feet wide and 100 feet long. The roof and the windows were trimmed with the same peeling white paint as the guard shack. 4 evenly spaced windows lined each floor. I peered into one, and for a moment, it felt like I was looking back in time. Old wooden desks remained covered in papers and other office relics. Paperweights, nameplates, scattered pens frozen in dust. A few tall gray computer consoles dominated the back wall. Most of the chairs and drawers were ajar, some fallen over or spilled out entirely. I made my way around to the entrance. The doorway was wide open. The hinges were twisted, and some were torn completely off the frame. The shredded white door lay 20 feet away at the back of the room, leaning against the staircase. I cautiously stepped inside. The small foyer was decrepit. The adjoining walls were perforated with large fissures, opening up windows into the adjacent rooms. As I entered the room I had viewed from outside, I had to pull my shirt up to cover my face. Decades of dust were distributed all at once by me opening the door. It floated in the air like ash before slowly descending to the floor. The nearest desk was buried in scraps of yellowed paper, most of which were rendered illegible by age and water damage. As I shuffled through the mountain of paper, a thick gray sheet was revealed underneath. The writing was significantly faded, but the format was familiar. It was a newspaper. At the top, bold black ink caught my attention. US. Red tanks move to border. Soviets to blame. Friday, October 27, 1961. I hesitated. This was exactly the kind of thing I was searching for. The bottom half of the newspaper was damp and smeared, but the top section was still legible. After I finished carefully combing through the document, I continued about the room, looking for anything else I could find. In front of the computer consoles on the far side of the room, a large rectangular desk caught my attention. The aged canvas paper that covered the desktop was scratched and torn, but I understood immediately what it was. It was a map. The giant illustration was a lattice work of 10 green and blue splotches. Red lines ran throughout the map like hundreds of tiny blood vessels. I shined my light across the image and swiped as much dust from it as I could. Faded black names littered the map, indicating towns and cities: Paris, Amsterdam, Munich, Vienna, Warsaw, Berlin. I could barely make out the East German city under the large X that covered it. The same red ink was scribbled next to the marking, barely legible. It read, Nuke Flash. More red X's appeared all across Eastern Europe. Some of them were underscored by hastily written labels. Others were simply marked with a red question mark. A handful of green circles indicated something different. The only legible label read, ODA, Green Light Team, question mark. I must have stared at the table for hours. One question bounced around in my head. Is this real? Before I could continue that train of thought, I noticed something. At the corner of the map, more thick paper hung out from underneath. I slowly pried up the document and peered under it. More maps. Maps of the region we were in. Maps of the US and of Russia. The same scribbles adorned these two. My chest tightened. I dropped the papers and stepped back. What the hell was this? Walking around to the computers, I searched for answers, but I found none. The screens were dead. Some were cracked, their plastic casings warped with age. On a few consoles, casual notes were taped to the desk to inform the operator about drills or meetings, but I found nothing to implicate the map's purpose. It must be for drills or war games. Drills. War games. That had to be it. I repeated the thought like a prayer. I hesitantly walked towards the exit, glancing back around to make sure I didn't miss anything. I kept up the affirmations as what-ifs bounced around in my head. I made my way back outside. No matter how many times I tried to convince myself, deep down, I don't think I believed it. I still couldn't shake one recurring thought. Why was everything left out? Why did they leave in such a hurry? A few dozen yards away, I came across another structure. This one resembled an old oil drum, flipped on its side and buried halfway in the ground. It was a small hangar. The corrupted steel shone brightly in the evening sun. Despite the overgrown nature of the previous buildings, this one seemed almost pristine. I spent a lot of time in and around aircraft hangars as a kid. One thing they all have in common is the smell. A sickly sweet mixture of fuel, lubricant, and hydraulic fluid. This one was no different. When I peeled back the large rusted door, that concocted smell hit me in the face. But something was different. The poorly vented structure had smothered mold, mildew, and other ungodly scents and discharged a putrid miasma into my face. A violent coughing fit overtook me as I staggered back away from the door. The dust and debris had entered my lungs and clung in my airway, as if the suffocating stench inside had been entirely transferred to me. I forgot the damn mask. After I cleared my lungs and caught my breath, I retrieved it from my pack and fitted it to my face. The mechanical breathing was a bit more laborious, but worth it to avoid inhaling whatever that was. Tentatively, I peered inside and flicked on my flashlight. I'm not sure what I expected. Maybe a plane or a missile? But of course, I was met with nothing of the sort. In the center of the hangar was a long metal rail, the end tipped up towards me. On either side of it were miniature hoists or cranes, kinda like the ones used in mechanics' shops. The floor and walls were littered with toolboxes and loose equipment. The thought flashed in my head again. Someone left in a hurry. I was thankful to remove the mask when I stepped back outside. The evening air felt heavenly. The sun had now set below the trees, cooling the air to a brisk and comfortable temperature. As I stopped moving and my breath settled, I came to an unsettling realization. It was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no bugs, not even wind, just me. That electric feeling had returned. I stood there for a moment before it dissipated. After a few seconds, I heard a few scant chirps and the long trill of a far-off bird. I tucked my thoughts away and kept moving. A wide gravel path sat out front of the hangar, stretching for 50 or so yards in each direction. To the left had been the old building, and to the right lay another gate. This one was blocked with a red pole, swung down to act as a barrier. A larger guard shack, double the size of the previous, protected this checkpoint. I realized that I was actually on the inside of the checkpoint, as everything faced outward towards a bend that led back to the main gate. To the left were a few short towers, topped with small radar dishes and white domes. As I approached them, something felt different. The charged air was now compounded with an almost inaudible yet tangible humming. Faint, almost imaginary, but I felt it in my chest, in my teeth. An uneasy feeling grew in my gut. I continued down the path and recognized it to be a loop, forming the shape of a large arrow in the earth. A few garage-like structures lined it, but I elected to come back for them another day. It was now dusk, and I didn't think being out there in the dark was the best idea. As I followed the loop, I headed back towards the light blue building and my entry point that lay beyond it. My eye caught something far off the road to my right. Yellow. In the dirt off the edge of the path was a large concrete slab. It was trimmed by dirty yellow paint, forming an elongated rectangle. Centered in the shape was a different material. Metal, split down the middle by a deep divot. I froze. Not all Nike sites had underground missile facilities, but this one. Off to the left side of the slab was a raised concrete hatch. Sticking a few feet out of the ground at a low angle, two metal doors stared back at me. My gaze locked with the doors. My pulse quickened. The humming returned, blocking out all other sounds. You need to know. The thought overtook any rational notions in my mind. A deep longing settled over me. My conscious mind receded and was replaced with a reverie. The sun had retreated completely now. The night deepened. I didn't move. I didn't care. I had made up my mind. I don't know why I remember that moment in so much detail. It had a sense of finality to it. The old rusted metal doors stared back at me. Flecks of yellow remained from its once pristine coating. Despite this, I could still make out the writing on the steel. F01. I set my back down and retrieved the gloves stowed at the bottom. Sliding them on, I placed the flashlight between my teeth, focusing the beam on the corroded chain holding the handles together. I fastened the bolt cutters around the most visually decayed link and squeezed. Nothing. I kept ratcheting the handles, the teeth of the cutter digging further and further into the corroded metal. I backed off for a second before pulling as hard as I could. The brittle metal fractured with a deafening clang. The chain links sparked and recoiled violently to the dirt. Then it was silent. Dead silent. The soundscape turned off like a light switch. I glanced up and looked around. Still, the stony silence remained. My gaze returned to the unsecured hatch in the earth, and a lump formed in my throat. I had snapped out of it. What was I doing? I was prepared, sure, or as prepared as I could have been. But was I about to descend into a Cold War-era bunker in the middle of the night? Alone? Before I could seriously reconsider the reality of my situation, that inner dialogue was wiped from my mind quicker than it had entered, replaced yet again with the feeling that drummed up with me. When I saw the door, an intense infatuation, a lustful desire, one phrase calmly flashed across my subconscious again and again. You need to know. You need to know. A feeling of resignation flooded over me. Something deep within me ached to know what lay beneath. I needed to know. I reached down and gripped one half of the rusty trapdoor. I heaved it up and threw it to the ground. The darkness of the tunnel below it was impenetrable. The beam of light in my hand disappeared into the black. I stood there unmoving for a moment, transfixed on the opening. The opaque pit stared back through me. I slowly recovered my resolve and dealt with the other cellar door. I put my tools back in my bag, fitted my respirator, and flipped my headlamp on. The light was much stronger, but when it shone down the concrete steps, it fared little better than the pocket flashlight. Still, I managed to make out faded white footprints leading up the stairs towards me. I stepped forward onto the precipice. I felt it again, the unwavering dread, the same feeling I got when standing on the stairs in the forest. My stomach churned, but my eyes remained transfixed on the inky blackness below me. You have to know. I took one hesitant step down, and the light advanced. I had decided. The concrete tunnel compelled me to enter, and I began descending into the darkness. A large metal door rested at the bottom of the staircase. As I passed through it, I entered a large open room. The temperature dropped drastically, and the cold tore through my thin jacket. My footsteps landed with wet slaps. The small puddles in the warped concrete rippled away into the dark. I adjusted my headlamp and took in my surroundings. On the other side of the bunker, a huge, rusty orange rectangular slab rested about half a foot above the concrete floor. Large struts raised up past the ceiling in each corner. As I walked over, I noticed that the ceiling above the slab extended further upward, culminating in two metal doors. A decrepit yellow sign sat on the wall nearby. Caution, do not store missiles with JADO fins extended over elevator pit. Nearby, machinery ached and settled, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I walked around the expansive room with slow, uncertain steps. My eyes scanned everything they could see, and the echoes of my footsteps continued bouncing around the chamber. At the back of the magazine room was a long cylindrical tunnel. The walkway of the passage was slowly lower than the floor, curbed on either side by 3 or 4 inches of concrete. Pipes stuck out of the wall in places and traveled down the length of the shaft. Staring down the borehole, I began to feel lightheaded. My skull began to ache, and nausea crept into my vision. Something about it demanded my attention. Not the tunnel itself, but something at the end of it. I strained my eyes to see past my headlamp's range, but it was just more rock and metal. I swung my back to the side and retrieved a glow stick from one of the pouches. As I did, the beam of my headlamp caught something smeared onto the wall next to the entrance of the tunnel. White paint. The hazily smudged graffiti made out one word: listen. I stopped moving and did as instructed. The complete silence was only periodically interrupted by the sound of dripping water. I immediately felt ridiculous for entertaining the obscure wall art. I tossed one of the sticks down the passageway. The green light landed with a faint metallic clang that reverberated back through the narrow corridor. It bounced and rolled to a stop, illuminating the end of the tunnel and a large steel door behind it. I began to move forward. Each step I took was slow and deliberate, landing with a heavy clack that resonated through the floor. When I arrived at the other end, I was met with a safe-like hatch. I gripped the valve on the door and cranked it as hard as I could. It struggled, but twisted with a squeal. I slammed my body against the hatch and pushed it as hard as I could. The metal ratcheted against the floor with a grinding resistance, but it kept moving. On the other side, I was met with another large, rectangular-shaped room, but this one wasn't as empty. In the center of the room was an industrial metal staircase that rose into the ceiling. It was surrounded by intersecting catwalks, some of which were broken off and hanging down like vines. Thin steel supporting columns jutted out from the floor. A few ragged tables and old signage indicated that this was a common room. To my right was a thin hallway. Across the room to my left was another long cylindrical tunnel that stretched off into the darkness. I chose the corridor on my right. Cracked wooden doors split off into various rooms on either side of me as I advanced. One was a bathroom, torn apart by time and decay. Another was something akin to an old office room. File cabinets and dressers were all toppled over onto each other in a giant heap in the center of the room. There were a few storage closets, one filled with rusted barrels that I think may have contained fresh water at some point, and another with boxes of long-expired supplies and rations. Then I heard something. It wasn't the slaps of my feet or my own mechanical breaths. It was distant, dulled, and electronic. I strained to listen. It was a shrill whining, followed by higher-pitched screeches and beeps, and then silence. A few seconds later, the noise repeated. It continued on the cycle like clockwork, cold and precise. The piercing sound reached beyond my ears and embedded itself deep within my chest. It called to me. You need to know. I was so transfixed on it that I didn't even realize I was moving towards it. The short, cramped passageway I had entered led me further and further away from the large room and deeper inside the facility, bypassing a caved-in doorway that led into an adjoining room. My eyes refused to leave what awaited me at the end of the corridor. Nothing else mattered anymore. A thick steel door with a locking mechanism rested in front of me. Like the rest of the facility, it was rusted and corroded, but it stood at the end of the passage, unwavering, almost shimmering. The noise played again. It beckoned me towards it like a moth to a flame. I reached the door and brushed the decades of rust of a small black sign that rested on the wall next to it. It simply read, Integrated Fire Control Systems. I grabbed a hold of the huge handle and forced it open with a loud, thundering screech. The second the airlock broke, the screeching noise tore through the quiet air. I instinctively flinched backwards, but the feeling remained. It commanded me to move forward. On the other side of the small room, a large console with ancient monitors waited. All of the screens were blank, just as dark as the room they resided in, except for one. A dull green emerged from it. Hesitant, but overcome with a blanket of familiarity, I stepped inside. This room was fairly small, yet densely packed with huge consoles, housing computer monitors and radar screens. My mind kept thinking on one thing: launch room. The noise snapped me back from my awestruck stupor, cutting through the air like a knife. Have you ever called a fax machine before? It remains quiet for a moment, before releasing the high-pitched tones of the handshake sequence. It whines and beeps and then goes silent as it waits for a response. And then it begins again. That's all I can think of to describe the sound emanating from the console. An electronic call and response stuck in an infinite loop, calling out to something or someone, waiting for a response. I walked towards the dimly lit console. You need to know. The thought flashed across my mind again, stronger. My attention was hijacked by a red handset that rested ajar from its cradle. I needed to know. The console whirred again, but another noise trickled in. Faint, hissing, open static from the phone's speaker. At first, the sound was cold, but now I knew better. There was warmth in it. Wrong, but irresistible. It needed me to know. I reached down and pulled it to my ear. I heard the quiet static thinning, fading into something quieter, more familiar. A small whispering voice. It crackled indecipherably for a moment, and then the voice became clear over the static. It was counting, backwards, from 20, 19, 18, 17, 16. The pull of the noise, the calming warmth, it all receded in an instant. Clarity cut through me like a knife. The console shrieked, and I violently recoiled from the phone. I tossed it back on the console and stepped back. Faintly, the counting continued. 10, 9, 8, 7. I ignored it. My eyes were glued to where I had thrown the phone. Taped to the console was a tan piece of paper, brittle and darkened by fire, like someone changed their mind halfway through burning it. I could still make out most of it, but one line caught my attention first. The first words to catch my attention were at the bottom. Autonomous launch protocol granted in absence of NORAD signal. I scanned the document rapidly, trying to make sense of it. At the top, a lengthy preamble remained. Top secret, eyes only, U.S. Army Defense Command, HQ, ARITCOM Region 4, date, 29 October 1961, subject, Nike Site F-01, standby to active engagement protocols, Operation Iron Veil. Some of the ink was smudged, but the letter continued. By direct order of the President, response to confirmed Soviet tactical nuclear strikes in the Berlin sector. All Nike Hercules systems under ARITCOM. Authorization for autonomous engagement is granted under Joint Chiefs Exec, contingent upon degradation of direct NORAD communication or nuclear disruption of the chain of command. Sustained signal anomalies to be treated as hostile incursions. Launch authority. Decentralized per wartime protocol. Maintain warhead integrity. If communications fail, assume continuity of hostilities. God help us all. Signed, Lieutenant General Thomas F. Hickey, Command General, ARITCOM. I read the letter again and again, but my brain had ceased all coherent thought. What? Iron Veil? Soviet strikes in Berlin? That never went nuclear. Then I remembered the maps. Nuke flash? The red axis? No. The counting on the phone began to repeat. What the fuck is this place? I shambled around the control room, frantically flipping through old papers strewn across the desks. I was searching for something, anything to confirm what I had just read. On one of the consoles, a tape hung out of an open tray. It was labeled Post-Launch Procedures. Suddenly, a thought entered my mind, one that I knew was a bad idea. Before I could have any second thoughts, my hand reached out as if piloted by somebody else. I pressed on it, and the tape receded into the machine. The tray closed with a sharp click. The floor shuddered like it could feel its own decay. The air felt charged again. I waited for something to turn on, something to happen at all, but nothing did. I gazed back at the terminal. Dust from the air hung in the beam of my headlamp. The electronic shriek broke the silence. No. I turned away from the terminal And that sound, that terrible whine of the machine pleading for an answer. I made it 1 or 2 steps, only to realize something. It had stopped. It was trying something else. The red phone now hung from its cord, but the counting had ceased as well, replaced by a crackling static. God damn it. Slowly, I reached down, picked it up, and placed it to my ear. The static was gradually replaced by a calm voice. Male, American, professional. Proceed to final. Repeat. Proceed to final. They are not coming. We are alone. The static returned. Then another voice. This one sounded different. Cracking. Afraid. They never stopped. It's still burning. You're not supposed to. The phone went silent. The air still hung in the room. One final transmission played over the speaker, barely above a whisper. It's still down here. I didn't wait for more. I threw the phone down and backed up. The panic I had felt on the stairs returned, but stronger. The console, I couldn't take my eyes off it. Its tones screamed and pleaded and begged for me to answer, but my body couldn't stand it any longer. My heart slammed around in my chest, and pain bloomed behind my eyes. I was moving. When I reached the hallway, I began running, back down the hallway, away from that room. Something was wrong. None of this made sense. Was that a recording? Who was it talking to? I made my way back into the common area, but I had to stop to adjust my respirator. I was struggling to get enough air through the mask as my heart rate climbed. As I was doing so, I noticed my light beginning to dim. Reaching up to adjust it, my hands barely made contact before a sinking feeling washed over me. My headlamp flickered for a moment. Then it faded out completely, pitch darkness replaced with white glow. I tapped it a few times and tried turning it off and back on, but nothing happened. I just changed the damn battery. I grabbed the spare flashlight out of my jacket pocket and clicked it on. The warm light felt like an oasis in the desert. My rising heart rate began to steady, and I resolved to make my way back out. As I glanced around the room for the final time, a rising dread gripped my chest. The small flashlight too faded slowly and vanished completely in the dark. I frantically tapped the flashlight, and it struggled back to life before fading once again. No, 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 no. My pulse quickened again, and my stomach sank. The respirator made it hard to tell what was real. My breath became this loop. In, out, hiding every other sound behind it. Was something moving? I couldn't tell. I could see nothing, and all I could hear was myself, hissing like a machine in the dark. Then I heard it. A deep, guttural, metallic grinding. It fluttered down from the long tunnel ahead of me and reverberated through the open space, lingering for a moment before returning to silence. Complete, utter silence. The quietness was then interrupted solely by soft, distant, metallic thumping, like something being dragged across the floor and dropped over and over. My exasperated respirator breathing interrupted each blow. Thump, thump. I froze, almost as if I returned to my right mind from someplace else. I realized exactly where I was. I was dozens of feet underground in the pitch-black darkness, alone in an abandoned structure. Nothing else mattered. The potency of that sound woke up a new kind of fear in me, the kind that you feel in your soul. A primal fear that lies dormant in us all, pure, unbridled, visceral terror. Despite every logical explanation or rationalization, my body was certain. Something or someone was in there with me. Thump. My legs locked. My heart was like a fist, slamming into my ribs, again and again, like it was trying to get out. My breathing stuttered and choked. My brain instinctively tried to quiet my breathing, but the respirator made it impossible. Another thought flashed across my subconscious. It can hear you. I tugged at the straps across my face. Everything felt too tight. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, louder than my thoughts. Then the ringing started. The piercing, needling whine assaulted my head and drowned out every other sense I had. I clenched my jaw, hoping it would stop, but it just kept climbing. Higher, sharper, like the pressure in my skull was rising with it. Thump. Run. The thought beat against the inside of my head. My eyes strained to adjust to the complete blackness. Run. Thump. I stared blankly. I was frozen, transfixed in the direction of the noise. Run! I couldn't take it anymore. I sprinted through the darkness, back the way I had come, towards the faint green glow that still remained in the entryway. I rounded the corner, but my face caught the large metal door I had forced open on my way in. The impact flipped me around and dumped me on my back. My respirator emitted a sharp hiss. I tried to stand, but the floor rocked sideways and my vision narrowed. I couldn't tell if the room was spinning or if I was. The hiss became more erratic. My breath hit resistance, like sucking air through a wet rag. Then the sound stopped completely. Just silence, and the sudden weight of the mask pressing down, useless. The filter was cracked. I instinctively clawed the device off my face and sucked in the foul air. It felt like breathing in polluted water. My lungs wheezed and spasmed. They desperately sought the clean oxygen of the mask, but received nothing but the lingering and rotten miasma of the bunker. A metallic taste bloomed in my mouth, thin and bitter, like copper or old blood. The noise again. It sounded thick and reluctant, like rusted steel being ripped from itself in a guttural groan. A few hollow thumps echoed in the dark, replaced with the sound of metal scraping against the concrete floor. I felt it in my teeth. I shouldn't have been able to move. My head spun and ached, but it didn't matter. My body didn't care. The pain remained buried behind the noise, distant, an afterthought. I was moving backward. The noise buzzed louder inside my skull. Run. The pressure in my ears became unbearable. All I could hear was the wheezing and rasping of my own breath, followed by the hollow metal thumps that reverberated through the long corridors. The ringing. It grew louder and louder as the pressure continued to amplify. I could no longer tell which way was up or down. My body broke out into a violent mixture of stumbling and crawling. The undignified struggle intensified as my limbs threw themselves out in front of me and pulled me further into the dark. I have to get out. That noise again. I swung around in an instant, my eyes desperately searching for anything, any movement, any light, any sign of what it could be. Thump, thump. But all I could see was the fading green light of the glow stick at the end of the passage. It continued to fade as the room behind me grew darker. Thump, thump. I tried catching my breath. I almost resigned myself to lie down in the dark and die. But then, that damn smell, that moldy, decomposing, festering smell flooded over me like a wave. I wrenched myself to get to my feet and began running, whipping my head around in time to collide with the concrete wall. The pain in my head returned, but something within me numbed it. Get out. The shriek of the metal reverberated again, closer this time. Thump, thump, thump. My hands desperately searched in the growing darkness. It had to be here. Before I could react, my hand grasped the heavy metal door, and I practically threw my body towards it. I kept clutching frantically towards where I thought the opening was before I found it. I pulled myself forward as hard as I could. Tumbling into the abyss, my knee made instant contact with the heart-elevated block of the stairs. I gasped in my pain. My leg reverberated like it was on fire, but my hands didn't care. Almost like they had a mind of their own, they reached up and made contact with the ascending steps. Pulling my body even further, I scrambled up the stairs like a wounded animal. Every movement was violent and uncoordinated. My gloves and my pants tore on chipped shards of rock. But I didn't care. The skin on my hands and knees scraped off, but I didn't care. The abrasive howl tore through my focus again, this time at the base of the steps behind me. The metallic taste returned to my mouth, followed by the rotting stench. The ringing in my ears crescendoed, but I kept going. The outside air grew closer, but my vision caved in and threatened to collapse entirely. My field of view seemed to recede further down the steps as I kept up my struggle. Finally, I emerged into the dark forest and threw myself out of the tunnel. I tumbled across the dirt and came to a stop on my back, my lungs retching for any sign of fresh air. I clawed at the side of my head and ripped the dead headlamp off. The suffocating pressure of its wraps was too much. My desperation to escape didn't end at first contact with the surface, and I rolled onto my stomach and pushed myself up with my good leg. My pack went tumbling off my shoulders as I did. No thoughts of turning back to grab either crossed my mind. I ran like a rabid animal, crashing into hanging tree branches and stumbling into bushes. My eyes were transfixed on the dirt path beneath me as I scrambled through the darkness. After an eternity, I finally made contact with the chain link fence. Maniacally, I tore the broken pieces away and shoved myself through, further shredding my clothes and skin as I went. I managed to crawl along the undergrowth for a moment before my arms gave out entirely. My body crumpled into the dirt like a toy that had run out of batteries. My heart thundered against my ribs, and the pressure in my chest rivaled that in my head. Much like the rest of my body, my diaphragm began spasming and dry heaving, desperately attempting to draw in as much air as possible. Once I regained a modicum of bodily control, I pulled my face up from the dirt and noticed something. The peeling skin on my arm was illuminated by a faint light emanating from behind me. I turned myself over to face the hole in the fence. Bushes and trees obscured its backdrop, but a bright white light illuminated the darkness behind them. My headlamp was on, then it turned off, then back on, off, on, off, on. It hesitated for a moment, like the brief after image you see when you turn a lamp off in a dark room, and then it went out. I was left in complete blackness. The overarching trees blocked out any possibility of ambient moonlight. All I can remember after that was standing on the overgrown trail. I was looking towards the way I came in, the inky blackness replaced with the pale blue light of the morning. I could barely make out through the shattered screen of my watch what time it was. 4:45 a.m. I followed it, eventually crawling back under the trees and finding my way back onto the main trail as the sun peeked through the evergreens on the lakeside. When I stepped onto the black asphalt, a feeling of calm washed over me. You know when you are scared of the dark as a kid and you hide under your blanket because somehow it makes you feel like nothing can hurt you there? The instant my foot made contact with that path, that same blanket of safety draped over me, it's like I was somewhere else and I stepped back into the here and now. The trail led me back to the parking lot. I sat there for a while before I pulled the keys out of my pocket, started the car and left. For some reason, I didn't drive home. Instead, I ended up at a random parking lot nestled behind my college. For a while, I just sat there, staring straight ahead and trying to make sense of the scattered processes of my mind. I pulled out my phone and started frantically searching for anything I could find that could tell me I wasn't crazy. I found 18. There were 18 Nike sites listed on every page I could find, every single one in my state, but none of them matched. There was no site F01, and as far as I could tell, there never was. I must have sat there until mid-morning, writing down everything I could remember, but there were entire patches of time that felt missing. I entered barely after sunset. It felt like I was only down there for 30 minutes. I still can't make sense of any of it. The console, it was trying to connect to something. It was calling to me. I couldn't resist it. The counting, the voice on the phone. Was it speaking to me? I still don't know. I can barely remember how I managed to get out of there. Just crawling, scrambling through the dark. And fear, ungodly terror. That noise. Now I'm here. I've been sitting in my room for the last few days, and no matter how hard I try, I can't find anything. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I can't bear to be in the dark. My head, the pressure is unbearable. Half the time, I'm too dizzy to even stand up. And the heat, it's so hot in here. When I sit in silence for a while, I can hear it. It trickles in slowly. Muted, but it's there. 19, 18, 17, 16. And then the ringing returns. That terrible, endless ringing. It was calling to me. I need to know. Why?